pedestrian crosswalk policy, and there's a lot of meaty packet, a lot of data in there, so let you.
Wonderful, thanks, Mayor and Council. We've got, Kevin and Steve have been putting together some information on how we might tackle this issue, and so I'll turn it over to them.
And I'll turn it over to Steve. We have a fairly brief presentation and some slides that we can work through to kind of engage the conversation, but feel free to ask questions throughout or just tell us we don't want to have the presentation and we can just open it up to questions. But we did prepare a presentation if you want Steve to walk through that. I think it might help set the table for the conversation.
I think that'd be great.
All right, sounds good. Well, thank you, Mayor and Council. So as Kevin alluded to, we kind of just have a brief slide deck here that we'll run through. And tonight's really just meant to be kind of an introduction to date, we install crosswalks with developments and in those areas, but don't have a comprehensive policy on how they're evaluated, how they're implemented, and we're just handling it on a staff level. So as we talk about potentially having a policy or working towards it or considering it, we just really want to introduce the topic, start talking through what it is, what it could be, what we're doing today, and just kind of move through that process. Next slide. So really, to date, probably the two beyond just striped crosswalks, the two areas where we've had the most conversation with residents revolve around the Ravinia Park amenity centers. There were some crossings there with some discussions, and really the Bellwether crossing across Stieg Road, as there's a cul-de-sac on the north side that kind of connects across Stieg Road to the rest of Bellwether. So those are probably the most two significant kind of considerations we've had to date, other than just calls and one-off conversations with residents. So right now, I just want to walk you through what the city does to date. So if today someone were to call and have a question, complaint, concern with the crosswalk, city staff just fields those phone calls and we evaluate them on an individual basis. Whether it's just a conversation, starts with that, might involve on-site meeting where we'll run out there, meet with them, see what they're seeing, kind of talk through them through what's going on with the site conditions. I know in the case of Bellwether, there was, I believe, maybe some on-site meetings, and they even came up and had a conversation with city staff where they kind of walked through things. So it's really just going through the course of conversations, explaining what's out there, what we've done to date, really the background to these developments. They've almost all revolved around developments and kind of new infrastructure. And then we talk with them about what, if any, options might be available. And again, just to recoup, we don't have any, when we talk about these approaches, a lot of times people think of they have to be the big signalized intersections, but they can be smaller things too. They could be, pedestrian bump outs. They could be just advanced warning signs. They don't have to be huge, significant infrastructure. They can be kind of smaller devices that can be effective on smaller scales as well. So like I kind of alluded to in the start, really our intention here is to start from the beginning, just highlight some key questions. And I think the important ones were in the packet. Really those big picture questions we wanted to outline to the council. We didn't want to spend too much time diving into details, but understand from a 30,000 foot view what are really those discussion topics. How do you guys feel about, how do you want us to approach them? And then really at the end identify if there's any really next steps to leave this with.
Okay. Is it?
There's more.
Oh,
There's more.
Gotcha. Sorry.
So I think really the first big question that we posed in there is, is it appropriate to develop the crosswalk policy? And it's not really meant, is a crosswalk policy appropriate? Yeah, they have their purpose, and they, there's communities of all sizes that have them, but, the advantages of having a policy, it provides that framework. So as we're getting requests for these things, or as we're evaluating with developments or, existing downtowns, it provides us an opportunity to be transparent and consistent with the public. If they know how they're going to be evaluated, we're treating people the same way. And we go about that approach really consistently from scenario to scenario. The policy also might just say it reinforces the existing system. Maybe it's just a way of saying what we're doing now works. Let's continue to do it. But again, it just helps us explain that to the public when they come in and have a conversation. They don't feel like we're being arbitrary with them, that we're following our policy and reinforced by council. So that could be an option too. One thing to be aware of obviously with any of these things we talk about, developing these policies from very simple to very complicated, obviously take time and resources. So, staff is at resources at a premium of everything that they have going on, and so didn't want to jump into going too far or taking it to a different spot without being mindful of it does take effort to get from here to there. So I think that's one of the big questions we wanted to pose to the council is it even appropriate at this time? That's kind of the starting point of, is this really the piece to be jumping into? And we don't have to answer right now, we'll continue to walk through them, but just kind of wanted a framework. By all means, if you want to stop and interject and weigh in, let me know, that's plenty okay, but I can keep going as well.
Sounds good.
So when we think about these crossings and these policies, a lot of times the areas where they're more specifically targeted toward or taken into consideration specific event-based needs. So we have the Lion Park, we have the City Park. As you relate to other communities, you think of, if you've been through Delano, they've got that downtown sports complex on County Road 30, where they have city parking lot across from their major event center. So you have some of those scenarios where they're really on focused event type scenarios. Really, they're structured around neighborhood parks, and a lot of times, so if you're going to develop a policy, taking that into consideration is always important. And also these situational facilities. So very often, as we get closer to schools, senior centers, some of those things that have other considerations, we want to make sure we're mindful of safe routes to school programs, things like that. Senior centers, sometimes there's considerations for maybe some enhanced criteria or different criteria that they're compared against. So just these various things all come into play. Now we're touching on a really wide variety of things, but it just goes to show, trying to highlight of, there's so much to be taken into consideration here that we don't want to be, or portray being short-sighted and jump into something without being thoughtful of everything that may go into play here. Jumping into implementing a policy and then finding out of all we didn't take into consideration. We took A, B, and C, but maybe D, E, F, and G also aren't accounted for here and might come back in the future. And then existing neighborhood crossings. We talked about within some of these existing neighborhoods that they don't have them today. How are those taken into consideration? And then obviously we have other jurisdictions, so we're just really talking about our roadway and our pedestrian facilities, but we have obviously the Three River regional trails that go through here. We have county roads that these will cross, and so a lot of times those are undertaken in conjunction with the project partners of, as we're chasing maybe those larger crossings or maybe consideration for other funding, grant opportunities, project partnerships, those all come into consideration in those areas as well. So this is really what we laid out in the memo, is just some considerations for some different approaches we could take with these type of programs. Not that any of them are good or bad, but just really trying to plant some seeds in your guys' minds of what these could even look like. And for example, maybe we've just thought of highlighting the bellwether just because it's the most recent one, of just trying to use that as an example of maybe how these programs could be implemented in that scenario. So if, let's say, for example, you had a very interactive program, it could be a program that has a committee that meets, that has stakeholders. There'd be public works, public safety, maybe there's your parks department, maybe in this scenario, community with a request, a community involvement comes in and they have a say at the table in that evaluation. So there's maybe an opportunity to bring together multiple stakeholders, multiple opinions, that sort of approach, which is good for making everybody feel valuable. One of the difficult parts of that type of approach is, how do you form consensus? You may have a scenario where public safety is saying that's a really good idea for that crossing, but enforcement is going to be a major issue, and us enforcing it's tough. Engineering may say, warrants aren't met, you don't meet the technical criteria, but the Parks Department and the neighborhood committee may say, but we see a lot of value here. You may have different stakeholders with all different opinions, and at the end of the day, how do you bring that consensus or that decision? And there needs to really be a defining authority at the end that really makes that decision. So there's a lot of positives of engagement, bringing other people in, but there needs to be thought in how do we get to an answer, because there's inevitably going to be differing opinions, just when we're trying to combine neighborhood stakeholder opinions which value or matter and are valued, but at the same point, an engineering strict criteria just might not be met. And then there's long-term, O&M considerations that Public Works will bring into it. They're all very valuable from their standpoints, and they're differing, they're all right, but how do you bring those together? So that would be one of the challenges with that type of a program. A technical merit-based program, so I'm sure everybody read their 110-page packet thoroughly, and there's a FHWA guidance in there, which is Federal Highway Association, very technical based. So you could, at every one of these requests, there's a calculation that can be done that looks at what is your traffic, what is your sight lines, what is your pedestrian users. We can take all this criteria in, compare them to a calculation, and then it may spit out an output. The challenge with this type of approach, if you refer back to that last slide when we talk about schools, senior centers, park amenities, those other things we take into account. A lot of time when we're doing merit-based approaches, it's tough to have a calculation that spans all of those other considerations that are important. But you can have programs that do that. Every time evaluation's in, we just want to do an engineering study. Everybody's treated fairly. Everything is on a criteria-based approach, and it'll guide us to a landing point that it's fair. Maybe the third option that's out there for consideration is a guidance-based program. I think the two examples in your packet were City of Shakopee and City of Albert Lea, have like a flow diagram and a kind of a matrix that looks at 2 or 3 major criteria. How many vehicles are traveling on the road? How many pedestrians are there? One of the big things we look at is what type of a roadway facility. What you would do on a 2-way roadway versus a 3-way versus a 4-way are very different what's recommended to do. And so it might take into account 2 or 3 different criteria and lead to a recommended category. Within that category, there's subjectivity, again, you go at any of these, it's who makes the decision. How do you come, there may be options, and at the end of the day, who makes that decision, but that may be an ability to guide and allow a little bit of that grayness that may be perceived by, like I said, those other facilities or those other considerations that guides you to a category, but within that category, we will all use our judgment to determine if any or all treatments are appropriate. So those are options. Those don't mean things that have to be followed. Those are just trying to plant some seeds for things. If we want, if we answered that first question of is a policy appropriate, is that something we want to do? Gives us kind of at least plant some seeds with you guys of here's some options out there. I like this. I don't like this. Here's kind of a way I feel fairly implements a program across the city. And then I think this will, as Kevin and Public Works and the city as a total, we look at how do you manage these programs from a resource. I know I started the conversation with tacking on resources from manpower and staff's time, which is important, but there's costs obviously with all of these. We can talk about the various treatments and things later, but there's costs for implementing a system, as well as just costs from all of these requests. As we talk about, if somebody comes in and wants something done, they request this to be looked into, how do you manage the staff time that goes into this, or the resources that go into the type of evaluation? Is it a escrow type program where, similar with development, a development comes in with an application and they provide an escrow to evaluate that development application and carry it through the process? Is it a cost of just the city? Is it a city core function? Is it just a part of us doing business? But we'll continue to see more and more costs associated with these, so just being mindful of how those are recouped.
And even,
No.
I'm jumping ahead.
Yep.
I didn't realize, I was gonna say, even like replacement and maintenance costs would, as we formulate budgets, I just realized I stole his next bullet.
Yeah, and the capital to go into it, but the ongoing operation and maintenance. Go ahead.
If there were a policy, could that be something that's installed as development streets go in as a way to mitigate the need for city investment on the startup?
It could be, if we had a criteria, so that's where having a policy may help. Right now, when we're looking, let's say, at development, many of the thresholds from a true warrant base are higher, right? So we can't point to those warrants as the threshold that requires it. So, I mean, just on the surface, it would make sense to me if there was a policy that guidelines them perhaps, but there's still ongoing, that may address the upfront capital, then you're still, in the 3-year span, in the, 10-year replacement, whatever it is for that certain.
Yeah, depending on what the structure is, right? But to Jeremy's point, that's where the city was a little short-sighted in these developments. We should have had the foresight to think, there's a park going here, and you have a busy street, or you have an amenity center and a busy street. You're gonna have people crossing that street to get to both sides. Same with the cul-de-sac on the north side of Steve Road. We should have put that in the process when they came to us with a PUD, that should have been part of the infrastructure. And I think right now we're playing catch-up because of that with these developments. But I think we definitely need a policy so that when future developments comes, that cost is borne by the developer and it's set up front. Some of these things are pretty simple to understand. There's gonna be people crossing and what type of people are gonna be crossing it. So,
Well, I think we do have areas to cross, we just don't have a formal crosswalk infrastructure.
right,
type of-
right. I understand that, but I mean, these are things that I think we wanna come up with a policy now. We have to play catch-up on some of these, but it should be a policy that we could implement with every development going forward. If we know there's gonna be some type of issue where people are going to be crossing a busy road, whether it's to access a trail or access a mini center or whatnot, we can bear that cost on the developer.
I think great points. I do think the more, if that's a goal, then some form of policy would definitely be recommended by staff. So I echo that and hear that. I'll point to another example of what's happened and I'm not picking winners and losers, just using data points. So if you can visualize the crossing north of City Park into Rush Creek, there's one of these treatment options. There's a pet island there for a Three Rivers crossing. So I would just say that we have evaluated where we think it's part of that to where it makes sense, right? That's a Three River Trail, it's crossing a county road, it's
Yeah.
near a park. So we did include some of that, but if we want a more formalized approach, if we want to look at key factors, and we want to make sure it's like a checkbox on every development, and at least have a conversation, I do think a formalized policy that helps us kind of leverage that conversation is certainly warranted, but I just want to give data points, and I certainly understand there might be disagreements and, opinions that specific to maybe Bellwether, but we have, I just want to be clear and give confidence that we just haven't avoided this. We just didn't feel like it was warranted or.
No, I mean,
So,
and his point, A, B, and C might be known at the time, but we don't know what X, Y, and Z is. We don't know what that is today, what's gonna happen in the future, right? But a general policy will get us some form of protection in the future.
And we'll still have there's always the short-term impact and then the long-term impact. So a lot of these conversations, when you talk about policy, is what can be done in the short term, and then the long term, it might be alleviated. We don't really know what the long term is, right? Long term could be 5 years, long term could be 20. So a lot of times there's gonna be a conversation about what happens in the interim. And Bellwether may be a good example of that. What happens in the long term, the Three Rivers Trail will cross at the midpoint. There'll be signals probably in each intersection, and you'll have controlled crossings at 3 points. In the interim, there isn't any, and so that's what we're talking about. What should we do in the interim? So really that gray area, that interim area is where probably our short-term policy conversations probably should be. That's where our effort, that's where I think our citizens are gonna be focused. Long-term, I think it's probably identified, but that interim scenario is gonna be the conversation piece, I think,
Right.
that we have.
Mr. Mayor,
Yeah.
I agree with catch-up. I agree with all of these things, everything you're saying. The one thing that continues to stick in my craw is who's going to, and I'm sorry, Matt, who's going to police these crosswalks? Who's going to manage these things? We're building sidewalks and neighborhoods are walking in the streets and not even using the sidewalk in the summertime. the Wildflower one in Ravinia, I drive through there because I want to see stuff. I've seen people jaywalking and not even going to the intersection to use what I think should absolutely be a crosswalk. Is that something that is going to be done? We've got bike paths, we got walking paths that aren't used now. I spent 29 hours up in Bellwether in Amberley back when there was traffic complaints and those kind of things, 29 of my hours. And it was interesting, it was random times on my days off, all throughout the day, early morning, mid-afternoon, late afternoon. And who's going to watch that? I have my numbers. I have something that looked like a construction vehicle going through that neighborhood, through that intersection close to where this pedestrian crossing would be. 84% of the construction vehicles abided by the traffic signs. Things, or vehicles that look like residential vehicles, 74% of the residential vehicles didn't abide by those signs. So what do we do to make these neighborhoods safe? And again, that wasn't a one-day snapshot, that was multiple days, 29 hours of time, when the neighbors aren't even using the amenities that we're giving them. And I'm not saying all the neighbors, I'm saying neighbors. And again, I wasn't looking for signs on the side of the vehicle, I was looking for sedans, I was looking for those kind of things, and even observing the drivers to see if they look like construction vehicles. But who's gonna police those kind of things, and then what are the repercussions for not using? An estimate on Bellwether, that traffic crossing, I'd love to see 4 or 5 rumble strips, both sides of that, because how crazy that road is. And the drive-through traffic and all of those things, how do we keep those pedestrians safe once we put up a crosswalk? And I'm really going outside of a boundary, I think. I nearly ran into a snowmobiler crossing a road that didn't stop for a stop sign on Highway 10, Tuesday afternoon about 4:15. I saw him coming, I was going 50 miles an hour, I started slowing down. I hit the brakes where they were crossing, all of a sudden they realized there was a stop sign, they stopped, spun out in the middle of 10, another person coming the other direction. That person I could have made a mess out of that person. What are we gonna do to that extent? I know I'm probably too far. I want a crosswalk at that Bellwether area, I want a crosswalk up at Wildflower. We're gonna need a few crosswalks in and amongst the Trevenia side. To Kevin's point, with the Hackamore redoing and stuff, there's gonna be 3 or 4 crosswalks added between 116 and over to 101. Just as what we're doing, I mean, we're talking about putting a walking path on the north side of Hackamore. We're doing all of these things, we need what we're talking about. Well, what are we gonna do to get that safety side out? What are we gonna do? What can we do?
So I guess, I think what you're talking about is changing human behavior, right?
Right.
And what is the right way to change human behavior? And we know that at the lowest form to get general large populace compliance is based on environment, right? When we talk about speed on roadways, it has to do with how it's designed early on, but you can extrapolate that across a lot of different industries. In planning, you have CPTED, crime prevention through environmental design, and it's a lot of it. One of the greatest things that impacts, like, I don't want to, kind of thoughtless human behavior is their surroundings and their environments and what encourages them on where they walk, how they walk, and the same thing with traffic. Now, we have, in law enforcement, you can see that we use different parts of the spectrum from verbal warning to citations. So the answer is not always the same of, we're gonna write jaywalking tickets for every person we see because that might be considered a lower threshold than, but we might write a ticket for every stop sign that we see somebody run. Now, again, that has to do with presence, if we're
Right.
if we're talking about human intervention versus environmental intervention, and everything that you see is a sliding scale, and they blend and are designed to work together. I think that these considerations, you know, as you look at the different options, you know, I really like the, you know, the third option where you can take data and blend, you know, policy with some of the data points in there to have, you know, some subjectivity for appropriateness, but a guidance to get there. You know, we look at kind of the holistic approach, and that's what we do from the law enforcement perspective, and we try and use the common sense approach. Another one that we hear all the time is, you know, bike lanes, or, you know, the comments on the trail
Right.
on County 19, and we still have cyclists using the roadway. The cyclists, if you ask them, the reason they use County 19 is because the trail is full of walkers, and, you know, and it's not safe for them to use. You know, we learn about the environment, and the environment changes, and so tying it all back together, that I think having some sort of a policy that takes into account the circumstances that exist, that those practices, or, you know, those solutions are based on kind of empirical recommendations, but you follow a flow chart to get there, probably has some merit. And I think doing that in development, you know, when that was, you know, crosswalks were talked about in Ravinia with the amenity center. And at the times when it was reviewed, it was, you know, the other north half wasn't completed yet. And they said, well, there's gonna be very minimal traffic at this time. Right now, we'll look at it later.
In
And-
Bellwether?
No, in this time I'm talking about in Ravinia.
In the Ravinia, and that's the wildflower, and the
the north side of the
amenity
neighborhood?
center, and shit.
The north side of Gleason, so there were pockets, you know, when the amenity center went in, there was, you know, only a couple houses here and there, but the initial houses were right across from the amenity
Right.
center, and,
Gotcha.
so when you look at it, you said, well, there's not the foot traffic, we'll look at it later, and that came back to, okay, it's later now. 'cause
It's
that-
later.
It's, you know, so I think it goes back to, what are our reference points? And I don't think every reference point should be waiting till people are yelling about it, or who yells the loudest gets a crosswalk.
Right.
So I think, you know, I really think a lot of the individualized feedback should be from the council policy, saying, you know what, we feel that in this scenario, you know, that we want to follow this empirical solution for if these stars align. I mean, I didn't get a chance to read all of the pages as you guys did, but, you know, like, when you review like the Shakopee packet or things like that, I think a lot of those can make sense, and I think there's value in doing that. And again, it's a better way to meet changing circumstances rather than having to constantly react, because we're getting the question more and more frequently.
You know, one kind of caveat to that is, I say this with best intentions, but the one challenge that we want to make sure we do in that sense of how do we kind of design a system, for lack of a better word, that works intuitively, as we don't want to create false sense of security.
Right.
So a crosswalk or even a signal crosswalk that you push doesn't, when you look at the data, it doesn't always make it safer, even though every person would feel like it's safer. And that's a huge challenge from a technical standpoint that we face, because it's kind of counter to intuitiveness. So that's where at least some sort of guidance to narrow off some things that are really out there, even if it feels like it's the right solution. So that's when we talk about a comprehensive approach. It's how do you kind of boil that down? How do you educate? What does it mean? And so I do think that that's, you know, that's kind of why we're here today, is to kind of lay that groundwork. But, you know, it's a crosswalk does not always automatically make it better, even though it feels better. And so that's that intuitive nature that we're trying to make sure we evaluate when we implement some of this stuff.
Up in Bellwether, there's paint across the roads now, right?
Yes.
Correct. Yep.
But no signage?
No. I
There's
don't
no
think there's any
pedestrian
signage.
sign or anything there, is there?
No, there isn't.
I don't think. Thank you.
Yeah, and that comment I just made is in general, it's not that any.
I'm just saying, we put that in before anybody came and said anything, or is that something we painted, or?
Nothing's been done since, we haven't done anything outside of the original development contract,
And that was
or any situation at Ravinia or Bellwether.
painting that crosswalk going Bellwether was done,
As part of the original.
part of the original plan. Okay.
I think Matt makes a really good point around how do we design these spaces to be inherently safer? In both the cases of pedestrians and drivers, people are acting consistent with what they perceive as a safe way to act. So if you've got a wide open field of view, no obstructions, it feels very safe to go faster. If you've got a curvy road that's got some stuff going on, there's signage, there's maybe a crosswalk sign in the middle of the road, that makes you pause, it trips you out of your autopilot, and you're gonna pay more attention in that area. So I think you're also right, Kevin, that there's things that can make a pedestrian feel safer, and maybe they take more risk because there are things there that aren't actually doing what we want it to do to the drivers. And so I think it needs to be balanced that it's not just marking, but marking probably helps. But are there other things that we can do as these roads are originally designed, or as we plant trees, or as we think about how we do bike lanes or no bike lanes? Are there things that we can do to make the environment calmer for the traffic, to make it safer, in addition to just painting?
Yeah, no, that's very, very well stated, and I think to elaborate on that, but yeah, the data will show to your, specific to your example of, you know, we want, they're called an RRFB, but do you mind going actually later on in the slide? This might help but there's some of these treatments that you talked about, and we can go through them in detail. Our key, yeah, go down.
Can I add one thing to Jeremy's point?
Sure.
I think we're kind of thinking about the same stuff. I think the Stieg Road design is horrible for safety. And I don't know how we work around that, but we just created a through street in a very, that place there needed a through street for people that want to get from St. Michael to Medina faster. It didn't do a thing for anyone in Corcoran, and made it worse for everyone in Corcoran. And I think in the future, when we have these, and we did do some adaptations when we put the neighborhood north of 30, between 101 and, well, the south end of that, we put curves in the road so people wouldn't cut through 30 to go north on 116. There was intentional design of having curves so it wouldn't serve as that good of a cut through. And in hindsight, having Stieg go straight through is dumb for safety reasons. I think we have, just in the future, we need to be more considerate about that, in my opinion. Because some of it is, I mean, if you're gonna make the argument that these actually don't make this safer, I'm open to that argument. I'd rather not go through the bother of putting them in if they just create a false sense of security. And you sort of said sometimes, and then you're sort of like making a counter argument. But I know you're gonna say something, Matt, but I don't wanna do things that pretend to fix problems. And it seems like what you're almost saying, it pretends to fix a problem, and I have no interest in that. So let's not do it if it actually is not gonna make anything safe. Even if the citizens are, we have to think empirically, not just, oh, we need this because people think we do. And not to discount the actual need of safety, it's just, we can't do things that actually don't improve safety.
And I would comment on, I think the stark contrast that you see of the straight Stieg Road is the roadway designs are designed from the long-range comprehensive planning of the road. So when we look at Stieg Road, that's a collector road, and what that does is it keeps people off of, in the future, if that was built to the same spec, for instance, as the neighborhood roads, you end up getting what we would want is the collector traffic through the other side neighborhoods if it's the same. So that road was designed that as the future of Corcoran, that is where where we want the local traffic to be going to as we're trying to get traffic out of our community.
Yeah, but that's not local traffic. It's only in theory local traffic.
Right, but regardless.
99% of the people on Stieg Road, once it's finished, are not gonna be people that live in Corcoran.
But if you have that road designed to the same standard as, for instance, the other, what's the neighborhood road right off of there on 116? If you designed Stieg Road to that same
101.
standard,
101st.
you're likely not going to reduce the traffic volumes. They're just going to be you're going to be zigzagging through more neighborhoods, right? You're displacing cars, and I think what we're trying to do is balance that future growth. So the starkness now is there. I agree with you that when you travel that road, it seems over-engineered for today's, and I think the answer is because it is. That 30 years from now, you're gonna look at that as, drive to Maple Grove and look at where some of their 4-lane roads are, some of their wider roads. The traffic it's intended to move in the future without having to rebuild the road. You can build it smaller now to fit today.
I think we should cul-de-sac it, seriously. We always have these arguments about safety and we shouldn't have a through street there. But, I'm just saying, in the future, there are competing interests about safety and roads and moving and traffic, and, it's like we always think about how fast can we move people through our town instead of the safety component of the people that live in the town.
I think efficiency more than speed of moving people through is getting them, because the more you can keep them on where they're supposed to be, the less they're in your neighborhoods.
The thing that's a problem here is we've screwed up this neighborhood is screwed up. Bellwether is on the north side of Stieg and on the south side of Stieg. That amenity center is for those neighbors in the cul-de-sac to the north side. Should have probably not been that kind of thing. If that
That's what I'm
makes
saying, is we gotta think about these
Yeah.
things before, like in the future, about designing these neighborhoods
Because
that
if
we have a.
Stieg has always been a collector, I've seen it, and I would have loved to have figured out a way to slow it down. I don't see even a roundabout at that corner is gonna slow it down, because I see people driving over the curbs on roundabouts and everything else as they
That's
go
old
straight
people.
through.
Old people do that.
Old people do that? I agree with everybody. What is the solution? And we're probably going too deep to solve Bellwether or Ravinia's problems right now. We're trying to put together a policy and stuff, but we gotta do something for both those two neighborhoods.
One way to help could be narrowing the perceived lane width as people are going through those areas. So if you normally have a 13-foot lane, maybe you do something with the painting, or talked about narrowing with having curb bump outs,
You can use those plastic temporary things in
or the temporary
summertime.
barriers.
Those
yeah.
seem to work.
Planting trees right next to the road.
Yeah.
Isn't that's true, isn't it?
Yeah. So
Having
Well,
trees.
That reduces visibility to pedestrians, that's better.
I know, but it slows traffic a lot. Everything's not as it seems.
No.
Having really skinny roads skinny roads makes people slow down.
Putting planters in the road also slows.
Well, they haven't slowed down on Hackamore. What they do now is they drive right down the middle to
Yeah.
avoid the potholes.
That's true.
Most people can't even drive down Trailhaven right now, so, unless you have a huge truck.
But like what you're talking about, or like, it talks about in here to get examples of like the flashing beacon light, motorists yielding at rates of 98%. You have something like that, that is part of the development in some of these high impact areas. And families teach their kids to go to those areas to cross,
So,
it should have an impact.
very good, and I think that a lot of these come together, but if I can interject, this helps highlight this conversation, why it's such a helpful So this data where you talk about the 98% yielding rate, if you actually look deeper into the data, if we want to talk about Stieg specifically, as you get to the wider roadways, they'll dramatically decrease their efficiency. And so that's why these conversations are so good, but we also want to be really mindful when we talk about all these behaviors of pedestrians. So this is one, for example, of at that Stieg intersection, we may say 98% sounds really good, but when we dive deeper into the data, that's gonna fall as we get to these wider crossings, that yield rate falls, and that's that false sense of security that we try.
Yeah.
So it's really understanding them. It's a number of solutions, that kind, or a number of considerations that go into them. And even when you look at some of those matrices, I'd say, you know, you talk about Stieg Road being a collector, we want to, you know, it's in the comp plan, they're kind of designed to efficiently move vehicles through. It doesn't mean that there's no safe way, but it means some of them need to be strategic. And so, you know, the thought being, knowing you have signalized intersection potentially one day at 101 in Stieg. You know, when you look at the long-term forecast, it might be likely. Same thing as we look on the west side, maybe someday, but we have the regional trail that follows that western axis. So instead of having a number of pedestrian crossings, we really just the strategy is likely bring them to a limited number of higher effective solutions. And so when we look at, maybe if we can go back a slide, you know, maybe it's forward one, my apologies. But there's larger level type improvements that create more effective driver behavior better. Some of those overhanging arms. If you've ever driven on Highway 12 in Maple Plain by the library there, you know, that's that next level of, you know, there's next level of treatment. Yeah, what we're seeing here, next level of treatment has higher yielding rates for those type of scenarios. But as we look at these collector roads, these are typically the type of, and so those matrix guide you to that right category, right? It's not a one size fits all. Your downtown, small, intimate roadway type solutions, you're changing different driver behaviors. You're right, you're trying to reduce, you have the ability to reduce, create shorter crossings. That solution is different than what we're gonna do. You know, you maybe have raised crosswalks that help create that visual. Well, you don't typically do that on Stieg because you have plows. You know, that's a heavy roadway, plow damage would take those out in a heartbeat. So, it's just a way of, sorry, but it's that's why taking, you know, having those options, but being mindful of where they fit within these scenarios is important as we look at it, because just one solution doesn't fix it. And to Kevin's point, I just want to highlight we really are mindful of not oversaturate. That false sense of walker security is really important, that we really don't want to create that of putting that walker in that scenario of I felt safe and therefore I put myself in a dangerous situation. I'd rather have them wait another 30 seconds to be in a safe situation than wrongfully feel safe. And so, not saying that their time or safety isn't important, but we want to make sure it's the right solution in the right scenario.
Well, some of these solutions could be seasonal too in nature, couldn't they? I mean, there's the example of the, you know, pedestrian crossing in the street or narrowing of the street using ballards. I mean, Wildflower Park probably doesn't get used nearly as much in the wintertime when it's full of snow, and I'm assuming
as much.
your amenity center probably doesn't either. So
That definitely doesn't, park.
things of that nature, you're not gonna have the volume of people crossing, so it might be that you use something more in the spring, summer, and fall time, right? And then we pull it out in the winter time and put it back.
And to your point, it makes them more effective if they lose that, it's there every day and I just ignored it, right? There's a term for it, but in the mind, you just become so used to it, you don't pay attention to it, so.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
And I just want to be clear that when we say sometimes these don't, there are some situations where these would be recommended. And especially as we get to a mature city, they will become like a requirement. It's just really this interim situation where it's going to be more of a policy decision, right? So
And
I just want to be clear that I'm not saying that all of these make it less safe or whatever. I just want, there are situations where we would stand up and say, yes, this is required. It's just how do we navigate that interim until we build out, and that's what we're going to start to feel over the next decade, because from a more technical standpoint, we don't have that kind of backbone that we would get when we are even more intense between pedestrian and vehicle traffic.
I think
So it's
from
going to evolve over time, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Can the policy look 10 years into the future when it sets what the expectations would be for a new street intersection? Or are you limited to what will actually be part of just that development?
We can try, but it's really hard to condition a infrastructure improvement 10 years out. There has to be, it's a,
What I mean is, can the thresholds that would trigger, say, a flashing beacon in the policy be low enough that it would happen as part of the development? Because we know that in 5 years or 10 years beyond, whatever the technical warrants might be are likely to be met. Can the policy warrants be lower to achieve a policy objective?
I think you tie it to the future use of the roadway, so, you know, to that end, maybe you could say, because this is a collector road that steers you in the flow chart to what your acceptable solutions would be, and it would maybe help get you there, but, you know, because as much as you don't want to spend money where you don't need to, as you're saying, try and future-proof what your investment is, so you're not doing it and then redoing it in 3 years, redoing it 3 years later, that, as you look at the intended use, we're never going to be able to fully predict what traffic will be, because we don't know what St. Michael and Albertville are gonna do for development or everywhere else. But I think when we look at road, you know, the best indicator of what the future intent of the roadway is would probably get you the closest, and then you could use your other local environmental factors to maybe dial that a little bit more for the appropriate one. So I think there's, to some degree, yes, based on the future roadway planning.
I think we
Can
get
I,
a good sense of it though, because even when Ravinia came in, right, they ghost plotted 13 phases and showed us how it was all laid out. The amenity center was there, the parks, both parks were there. Same with Bellwether. We knew that there was gonna be a cul-de-sac up there. We knew the amenity center was there. Personally, I'd like to come up with a policy that we can put into place now that would fit for these folks, but it would also be applied to all future developments, just like when they do a safety review of a preliminary plan that comes in now, and they said, you need to move this cul-de-sac, or you need a fire hydrant here, it would be part of that, it would all be known. Costs would be borne by the developer, and we'd be, you know, money ahead. There will be some cases that'll come up because of changes in other developments and whatnot, and we'll have to adapt to those, but I think we can get 90% of what we need if we come up with a policy now.
I agree. I would also suggest that we consider, is there an opportunity to use this to permanently in place some rural character into the infrastructure? So what do you think about, instead of having just rectangular bars for the crosswalk markings, what if you did silos?
Everyone likes that. Do they, they have to meet some sort of
There
requirement.
has to
I
be
don't know
some
how.
sort of standard.
They can be
yeah.
quite decorative. I've been looking around.
But cost goes up as
It depends, yeah.
design.
You just have to look
You need
at it.
stencils, that's all.
Let's just put silos on every
In the middle of the
corner
street,
and
that'll
in the
slow
middle of
cars
the
down.
street.
Street
and
signs?
Big thing that says, slow the hell down.
All our barns are collapsing, this
Not mine,
winter, so-
not mine.
Mine hasn't either, but
So,
I got a question. How good of a guess do we have on that pedestrian crossing over by the park and on County Road 10? How good a guess is that?
You mean cost?
Guess.
or.
You guys just said that should be where that trail is gonna come across, where that
We-
pedestrian island is, or whatever we called it.
we worked with it. I mean, in that development got approved, we established a route through there for the future Three Rivers Park. So
Okay.
that's in the right spot.
So you nailed it. Cool.
Well,
What happens to the park side? We don't know yet, right?
yeah, we did, I mean, that's why there's nothing on the other side, and so hopefully we incorporate something in a park plan that doesn't like shoot into a fence.
Got it.
Kind of what it does today, but that's the challenge we have, is like, we're a growing community, we can't nail like a full trail, right? We have to try to find spots where we stop.
The direction I'm going is, we have wetland delineation, we have all these things, we've got traffic studies, but part of that traffic study, does that need to add a pedestrian angle to it
I
to
think
make this happen? Is that the policy we're talking about?
I would, incorporating with a traffic study, like I said, a traffic study usually implies empirical data, and typically all of your, if we look at all of the data available, using an empirical analysis requires it to be there, and so it's very, to your point, can you forecast? We can try, but forecasting pedestrian movement and that sort of traffic is very difficult. What I'm saying.
But right now, we don't have that as an element of our traffic study
Correct.
as pedestrian.
Correct.
I mean,
Having a
we-
policy would give it better something to compare to than trying to find an empirical tie, is what I'm getting to, because an empirical tie requires growth and users to verify it, and it's very tough to do that just from a.
I think if the direction from you tonight is to continue to evaluate a policy, one of the things we would look at is how would that work? How would that function? How would that be integrated into our development review process? We don't have that answer today, but if that's the desire of council, those are the type of things we can evaluate and bring back to you if there's a good way to do that and kind of follow up. Again, this is intended to kind of set the table for what your appetite is, how far you want it to go, where you see value. So that's something we can bring back to you if that's an outcome of tonight.
I think to Alan's point, at least as far as with development, I think we're all on board with wanting to come up with some sort of policy so that when developments are coming in, we're able to get as much of that taken care of by the developer as possible.
Yeah, and I think right now, we only have, what, maybe 3 possible locations we would have to catch up on city streets if we were looking at putting in some type of crossing function.
Yeah, that come to mind at least.
And there's varying level of efforts. If you're talking about a seasonal thing at Gleason Parkway, that's really kind of low-hanging fruit. If you're talking about Stieg Road and longer span, the interim solution there is probably a little more costly. And, you know, that might take a different conversation. But yeah, it can be customized. That's the benefit of the guidance system, where it kind of wipes it down and focuses you on 2 or 3 instead of a whole bunch of ideas. It helps narrow that focus then we can kind of specifically evaluate those 3 instead of the dozen that exist out there. So that's the benefit of that guidance approach.
Do we have the a bandwidth to, you asked already, do we have the bandwidth to even issue tickets, enforcement? For, like, do we even have a single pedestrian crosswalk in Corcoran right now, marked?
Yes.
The Bellwether one, there's
Bellwether.
a painted one there.
Have we issued a single citation about people not
For
stopping
jaywalking, or-
for?
Oh,
Have we issued any jaywalk citations? Have we issued a single citation for not stopping for pedestrians at the crosswalk?
Not that I'm aware of recently.
So why do we have them?
Well, I get your point, but there's a 30-mile-an-hour speed limit sign in my neighborhood, and I doubt you've ever given out a speeding ticket either.
So,
Just
that's
because
what I'm
you can't-
asking.
You can't enforce everywhere, every time, every minute of the day.
I get
in
it,
the
but
city.
I'm just asking. It's a bandwidth issue.
We got
I don't wanna put-
crosswalks where there's no sidewalks at intersections.
But we just gotta be able to,
No, I mean,
County
they're
Road
geared,
30
they're
and
geared towards
116.
human nature, right? To try to change human
10
behavior.
and
So,
116.
is there a sign you can put on the pedestrian side where it's like, I know it is illegal for people to go through this pedestrian crossing, but
but they will.
be mindful of that, cause you weigh 100 times less than a vehicle.
I don't know, but you can't signage everything.
That's what I'm saying. All I'm saying is like, I'm skeptical of this. People, because I run, and there's so many streets that I sit and wait for traffic on. Like, there'll be usually 1 in 9 will let you go through. I'm skeptical that
You don't
these
just run because you're entitled as a pedestrian
No.
that you get the right of way?
people are looking at
see a
their
lot of- I
phone.
see a
It's
lot
just
of that.
crazy. It's
Yeah.
crazy. So, I'm skeptical of that it would actually make anything safer.
Don't encourage the
I don't
crossing
think
of the
just
road?
marking necessarily.
Huh?
Don't encourage the markings or the crossings of any of these
I don't know.
roads? Just stay in your own property?
I'd go back and forth on it.
Yeah.
I don't think the marking necessarily would in every case, but there should be ways to design intersections where it needs to be safe, to make it safe. And it seems like the Minnesota State Guide and the tables that they give us for the different situations with lane widths and traffic volume is a relatively straightforward way to think about it and still gives council some discretion. This seemed like the most useful to me as I went through the packet of the different systems. The flow charts seem to be pretty convoluted in comparison. So from a policy perspective, I don't know how much discretion we want to leave in a policy, especially if we want to use it to enforce installation of certain technologies. But to the degree that we can keep it easy to understand and easy to apply, ideally without having to do a traffic study, I think that would be beneficial.
Yeah, I think you want to be able to do it so that you can, to your point, it's forward-looking, right? Because we couldn't have done a traffic study on Gleason Parkway. There was no Gleason Parkway. It was Gleason Road, right? It was a dead-end gravel road at the time, so you wouldn't have passed any studies. So,
Is this the table, these are the tables you referenced?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They give based off certain.
Certainly a challenging topic, and
It is.
um,
It
I
certainly
appreciate
is.
that discussion. We haven't talked about this formally that I'm aware of. So it's even just engaging this conversation, letting it sink in will just lead to better outcomes. So there is, reasonable minds can differ on almost every one of these, and that's what makes them challenging. And so we just want to make sure we're being mindful in how we approach it. And so I just appreciate the dialogue. So if you have any further, not that we're wrapping up, if you ever have any further input, send that through me and we can continue.
I'm just doing a flyover. 19 and 30, we've got a Hennepin County Trail at some point going to be ours. There's no crosswalk mark. That'll be Hennepin County.
Well, see, that's
Three
the
Rivers.
There are
other,
three rivers.
the other.
So
yeah,
there's
Three Rivers.
there's no crosswalk marks
There used to
at
be.
that intersection.
There used to be.
Now that we've got what it is right now, they've got everything for that merge lane. When you go over to 30 and 116, we got 4 crosswalks there and no sidewalks to that intersection. We've got we've got crosswalks at 10 and 116 here, no sidewalks yet. We've got a lot to think about, but we've got to focus on Bellwether, Amberley, and, or catch-up, is that what we call it? It's catch-up
Yeah.
on Bellwether, Amberley, and.
But 10 and 116 is out of our purview.
I think
All of
them
these are, but-
were that, so the struggle is we don't control that right away. And all the examples you just went through, those are all county right away.
I know,
Oakdale.
but they've already got a plan. Oakdale and what?
Oakdale at 19.
Yeah. But technically, I think that trail.
There used to be.
is
There's
in
this much of it
19
left.
right
Most of
away.
it's worn off.
Yeah.
Yeah, that trail and.
That trail in 19,
Three
that's,
Rivers.
the right of way technically goes, the trail's all within the county right of way there.
Okay.
Even though Oakdale is a public road. So that's where we do have to partner with the agencies, but their programs dictate. We literally should be asking their permission if we're gonna start striping their right of way, right? And so it's gotta jive with their programming or whatever. So that there is jurisdictional elements there that we need to work with, and maybe it's, we work with the county to see if they, what their plan is for Corcoran. I mean, it doesn't seem
Yeah.
like it's coherent because they have crosswalks that don't have trails. I hear you absolutely.
Yeah.
Maybe part of the exercise is let's meet with the county and say, what are your plans for Corcoran? Do they jive with us? Can we synchronize that from a plan review development standpoint, from a trail standpoint, so that we make sense to the public? Because I agree, that's hard for me to say what's going on. I don't have an answer, but
Yeah.
other than we don't control that.
It was the same thing in Maple Grove. 10 was a 2-lane, and it turned into a 4-lane parkway. There's still people going 60, 65 miles an hour and then some in a 45-mile-an-hour zone. There's sidewalks on both sides. One's bituminous for bike riders, one is concrete for walking people. I mean, we did all of those things over there, and there's still people that don't use those either. But every intersection nearly has got a crosswalk. It might not be a 4-sided crosswalk, I'll say it. It might just be the 2 sides that hook to the concrete paths and stuff. I mean, there's there's other ones out there. You guys have really good examples in here, and is it something that you guys got a good idea of what you want to hear from us, or we just say we need to talk about a policy? You guys got a good idea? What do you got? We're jumping all over the place here. You guys are the ones that are grounded.
Well, this is what we expected, honestly, and this is why we want it in the work, because it's gonna take a little bit to hash
Yeah.
out. I think what we would need for direction is, do you want us to keep looking at formalizing a policy and bring back maybe a little bit more specific initial draft to a policy based on what we heard, and maybe some options of tweaking? That's what I don't know if you have other things, but we'll start developing the framework for a policy that then we can key in on certain aspects. But we didn't want to start that process if it wasn't
Yeah.
warranted, so we
Yep.
really needed to hear that. We wanted to go 30,000 feet to be like, when do we want to do it? And then maybe and maybe it's not to be decided today, but maybe in that policy we designate how we approach it. Do we want to increase the general budget by X amount per year because we think we might have 5,000 to evaluate these, or what, or do we do an escrow system, like if someone wanted to change the code, like just some direction to staff to build into that. It doesn't have to be answered today, but
Yeah, I
that'll
think
be a
that's stuff to
question
think
we
about,
continue
for sure.
to propose to you is how do you want to handle these requests, so,
Yeah.
so
I
just.
think to answer your first part, I think, yes, we're all on board with staff working on a policy.
I would add to that, are there things we need to do independent of that to deal with the hotspots for this year?
We gotta take care of the hot spots.
Maybe it's not the
even
fine,
while we're putting a
but are there
policy in
interim
place.
things that are relatively low cost that can still be helpful? Like in the report, it talked about the in-street signs being relatively effective. Between that and maybe narrowing down the lanes where we have the existing crosswalk at Bellwether, maybe doing something similar on Gleason, those could be relatively easy things to do that probably wouldn't be difficult to undo if the policy went a different direction.
Would you like us just to do that, or should we prepare like a proposal, a short
Probably.
proposal at the next meeting or two, just to give you some clarity?
Yeah,
about what
probably
we're-
should do that.
we're authorizing
Yeah.
this?
We'll look at by April.
There are two examples of challenges that are gonna happen in the future.
So you're talking about the
It
two we
just-
had in here, the Gleason Parkway Amenity Center and this Bellwether location, or do you want us to add a third of?
Well, you should do Wildflower Park too.
That's what we're
Well,
saying,
that's kind of a
Wildflower.
combined one, probably, the
Yeah.
Amenity Center and Wildflower Park.
Yeah.
Well, they're probably two separate because
Could be
the
two separate
distance.
crossings, but that area.
Kinda like
Yeah.
Al.
Ravinia.
You got three different levels, I think. You got a neighborhood with that community center, you got kind of a crazy road with Gleason next to Wildflower, and then you've got an extreme out at Bellwether, but we gotta do something at those three spots, I think.
So we'll put together like a proposal to kind of draft the framework for a policy. And then we'll put together a proposal for, broken out into sections, but focused on those specific resident concerned areas to date.
That'd be great.
And then-
Could I address
Sure, if
the
you,
comments?
sure, we'd love to hear from you. If you'd want to just come up and give your name and address for the record.
I'll be very brief. My name is Darrell Pearson. I'm a resident of Bellwether. We could have had, I could have 50 people in here. When we wanted to do something about the problem.
So, can we get your address real quick?
For the record, what's your address?
Oh, my address is 10325 Elm Lane
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you.
in Corcoran.
Feel free to go.
In any event, thank you. I'm very impressed with the way you operate and discuss and the depth at which you talk about this. But when we started this, a neighbor and I went around to every house, where there's 30 houses on the north side of Steeg. Could have had all those people here, but we have had them sign a petition, basically giving us authority to go speak on their behalf. We didn't go to the other side of Steeg because it's probably more important to us. It sounds like you all are very familiar with that intersection. It's like a 4-lane road. And when I came home last night from Maple Grove, I just looked at it, and at night, you're taking your life in your hands, trying to go across there at night. There's a street light on either corner, but you can't see that marked crosswalk. And I live right on Stieg. My sunroom faces Stieg. And I see the traffic there. And they rarely stay within the speed limit. And they're not the residents there. There are people who are going over to Dayton Parkway and people going down to 116. But in any event, the policy that you're talking about, the interactive policy that you're talking about, that is something, if you want community input, myself, another resident, and then John Horn, who's a civil engineer, you're familiar with him, he's on the planning commission.
Yep.
An invaluable resource that he would be. The other fellow's a computer engineer. I'm an attorney. If we can do anything to help you with the formation of your policy, aside from the more pressing issue, which we see as being the safety on that, please let us know.
Thank you.
And as far as using amenities, we use those amenities year-round. And it doesn't slow down in the wintertime, because there's a pool, there are all sorts, there's events every day, meetings every day. We go across there and.
Do you walk or drive?
It depends.
Okay.
In the summer, I'll usually take my bicycle. Because I play pickleball 3 days
Sure.
a week, my legs are pretty shot, and it's probably 3 blocks to the amenity center. If it's a nice day, I'll
Yeah.
walk, otherwise I'll take the car, but regardless. Anyway, appreciate your time, and the pressing issue for us is not the policy. We're willing to do anything we can to help with that, but there's gotta be something done in that intersection. It's very dangerous. People come visit us, we go visit other people. People walk their dogs, and you start at 55, but there are people that are in their 80s there. We're slow, we don't have good reaction time, and that's a scary intersection to go across. So,
No argument.
I thank you for your time.
No argument
you.
whatsoever. I've
Okay.
seen it.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate you
you.
coming out.
I want to be clear that even though I'm skeptical, or I'm not skeptical, I'm devil's advocating some of these things, like safety is really important. This is not a panacea for the issue of safety. I don't want it to be looked at as like, oh,
We're all
problem
done,
solved.
right,
It won't.
right. Yeah, makes sense. And maybe one last thing, I know we'll be talking to the Three Rivers Park District probably relatively soon with the cooperative agreement.
Yes.
Maybe it's worth seeing if they have any initial thoughts on what that crossing and other crossings like that in the community will be. And I know I was speaking to Marge Beard the other night about how they're excited to get going on a few pretty significant sections in Corcoran sooner than later. So maybe we can get some estimate on which ones and when. It'll be a rough estimate, but still good to know.
Did you convince her to go the long way around City Park with the trail?
Not yet. I'll work on it. But yeah. Anything else?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Wonderful.
Nothing else? I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
I move to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye.